For decades beneath the bloodline of their own father, the Appalachian Cave Children remained hidden. Deep in the shadowed hollows of West Virginia, where ancient mountains cling to fog and isolation breeds secrets darker than coal mine shafts, the story of the Blackwood family festered for generations, unknown to the outside world. It was 1967 when local Sheriff Thomas Denton first stepped onto the remote Blackwood property, responding to reports from a concerned hunter. This hunter, while tracking deer in the dense Appalachian wilderness, had glimpsed something unnatural. "Something ain't right up there," the hunter had told Denton at the station. He saw children moving like animals behind the cabin, then disappearing into the mountain itself. Stretching across 50 acres of rugged terrain in McDowell County, the Blackwood land was nestled against a limestone ridge. For decades, the family had maintained minimal contact with nearby communities, appearing in town only to purchase essential supplies, their interactions brief and guarded. Known for his unsettling gaze, Elias Blackwood, the patriarch, never let the shotgun leave his side. What would haunt the region for decades to come was what Sheriff Denton discovered that autumn morning. As we pieced together court documents, medical records, and interviews with the few surviving witnesses, the disturbing truth emerges like a shadow from the mountain caves where it began. The first signs of neglect were revealed by the approach to the Blackwood cabin. There was rusted farm equipment, overgrown fields, and livestock in poor condition. Weathered against the elements stood the structure itself, its windows covered with tattered cloth rather than glass. With visible distrust, Elias Blackwood answered when Sheriff Denton knocked. Consulting his notepad, Denton stated, "The property records show you living here with your sister Martha since your parents passed in '52. Anyone else residing on the property I should know about? Check if you're already subscribed to this channel." "Just us, Blackwoods," Elias replied, his knuckles white against the doorframe. "Always been just us, Blackwoods." But behind the cabin, the sheriff's trained eye caught movement, and despite Elias's protest, Denton proceeded to investigate. At the base of the limestone ridge, what he found would shock even his veteran sensibilities. Partially concealed by brush, a crude opening led into a series of natural caves adapted for human habitation. Illuminated by the beam of Denton's flashlight inside were 7 individuals of varying ages, all bearing unmistakable physical similarities, pronounced brow ridges, unusually small head circumferences, and malformed limbs. Most disturbing was their behavior, skittish, non-verbal, moving in a hunched manner as they retreated deeper into the darkness. From the cabin, Martha Blackwood emerged, her expression vacant, yet somehow pleading. "They are blood," she whispered. "They belong with their own kind." The horrific truth would later be revealed by medical examinations. The offspring of Elias and Martha's inappropriate relationship were the cave dwellers, hidden away from society to conceal their lineage. That this practice extended back 3 generations in the Blackwood family was uncovered by further investigation, creating a closed genetic pool that produced increasingly severe congenital abnormalities. In her report, Dr. Eleanor Harmon, who examined the individuals after their rescue, noted, "The physical and cognitive impairments observed in these subjects represent textbook manifestations of genetic disorders resulting from consanguineous reproduction. The severity increases markedly with each generation, suggesting a compounding effect of deleterious recessive traits." Exhibiting the least severe physical deformities was the oldest of the cave dwellers, estimated to be in his 20s, but he was entirely nonverbal. The youngest, a girl approximately 4 years old, had such profound skeletal malformations that she could barely stand upright. That Elias and Martha were themselves the children of siblings was revealed in court documents, raised in the same isolated tradition that viewed outsiders with fear and family bonds as sacred above all else. Check if you're already subscribed to this channel. To early Scottish-Irish settlers who had claimed this remote corner of Appalachia in the 1790s, the Blackwood lineage traced back, gradually withdrawing from wider society as industrialization changed the surrounding communities. Confer inscredo nescanal paranal parosmi chicantes irreveladores casos din hagens probias q moldarum communades interas migri du historias q associate tentquiser mascu caragum lix crucet sabra nasa humanade window into a hidden aspect of Appalachian history that scholars had long suspected but rarely documented was opened by the rescue of the Blackwood cave dwellers in 1967. Historical records revealed that throughout the region from the late 1800s through the mid-20th century, geographical isolation combined with economic hardship had created pockets of extremely insular communities. The physical isolation of these mountain communities wasn't just geographical, explains Dr. William Harrison, Appalachian historian at West Virginia University. It became cultural and eventually genetic when roads were impassable for months during winter, when poverty prevented travel and when outsiders were viewed with suspicion. The natural consequence was intermarriage with an increasingly limited genetic pools. An extreme even within this context, however, was represented by the Blackwood case. That rumors about the family had circulated for generations was revealed in court testimonies from elderly neighbors, but they were dismissed as superstition or ignored out of respect for privacy, a deeply held value in rural Appalachia. My grandmother used to say the Blackwoods kept to themselves because they had the mark on them, testified Meredith Collins, who lived 3 miles from the Blackwood property. Said it was God's punishment for breaking natural law. I never gave it much thought until I saw those poor creatures being carried out of that cave. The children, as they came to be known, despite some being adults, had developed their own primitive communication system. A rudimentary language consisting of approximately 200 sounds and gestures that bore no resemblance to English or any known dialect was documented by Dr. Lena Peterson, a linguist who studied them in 1968. And what's remarkable is that they developed the system in almost complete isolation from normal human linguistic exposure, Peterson noted in her research. It suggests an innate human drive to communicate even when deprived of conventional language models. A grim picture of the health conditions suffered by the cave dwellers is painted by medical records. Beyond the visible physical deformities, they exhibited numerous internal abnormalities, heart defects, compromised immune systems, and digestive disorders. 5 had severe vision impairments while 3 were completely blind, a result of recessive genetic disorders concentrated through generations of inappropriate familial relations. Crude sleeping areas lined with straw and animal hides were contained in the limestone caves that had been their home for decades. Simplified human figures and what appeared to be the sun and moon were depicted in primitive drawings that covered some walls, suggesting some concept of the outside world despite their confinement. More disturbing was evidence that the older cave dwellers had been trained to forage for specific plants and trap small animals, bringing their findings back to the main cabin. They served as providers for the Blackwood household while remaining hidden from society. The twisted logic behind their actions was revealed in Martha Blackwood's personal diary, discovered during the investigation. In one entry from 1953, she wrote, "The world out there would destroy them. They're pure Blackwood untainted by outsider blood. Yes, they carry our burden in their bodies, but they're protected from the greater sins of the modern world." Elias says, "God understands our ways." Their concealment had been made possible by the isolation of the Blackwood property. The nearest neighbor lived 3 miles away, and the dense forest and mountainous terrain discouraged casual visitors. At the end of the long driveway, local mail carriers were instructed to leave deliveries, never approaching the house itself. The deeply entrenched culture of non-interference was cited by several community members when questioned about why no one had reported the Blackwoods to authorities sooner. "Mountain folk mind their business," explained former postmaster Gerald Tucker. "That's how it's always been. You don't meddle in family matters, especially with folks like the Blackwoods who kept to themselves." That the Blackwood family's isolation was reinforced by local superstitions was also uncovered by the investigation. To their children, several older residents admitted to telling them to avoid the Blackwood property because it was haunted or cursed, stories that served to both explain the family's strangeness and keep curious outsiders away. The perfect conditions for the Blackwood tragedy to unfold undetected for decades had been created by this cultural protection of privacy combined with the remote location. A landmark case in West Virginia judicial history became the legal proceedings against Elias and Martha Blackwood. In February 1968, both stood trial for multiple charges, including improper relations, concealment of births, child endangerment, and neglect. With spectators, many of whom had traveled from neighboring counties to witness what newspapers had dubbed the Cave Family Trial, the courthouse in Welsh overflowed. The tone was set by prosecutor James Whitfield's opening statement. "What we are judging today isn't just 2 individuals, but a multigenerational crime against nature and humanity. The defendants not only engaged in behavior prohibited by our laws and moral code, but deliberately concealed the consequences of their actions, denying basic human dignity to their own offspring. An unusual approach was taken by defense attorney Raymond Lewis, arguing that the Blackwoods were themselves victims of their upbringing in isolation. "My clients are the product of a closed system that predates their birth," Lewis told the jury. "They knew no other way of life, no other moral framework. They believed they were protecting their children from a hostile world." About the severe consequences of familial reproduction across multiple generations, medical experts testified. "What we're seeing in the younger individuals is a concentration of recessive genetic disorders that would normally occur in less than 1 in a million births," explained Dr. Howard Jenkins, a geneticist from Johns Hopkins University. "The probability of these conditions increases dramatically with each generation of closed reproduction, creating a cascade of compounding disabilities." Perhaps the most compelling testimony came from Dr. Caroline Fieser, who had worked closely with the rescued cave dwellers for 6 months at a specialized care facility in Charleston. Despite profound physical and cognitive challenges, these individuals demonstrate the fundamental human capacity for connection, Fieser stated. "The oldest male, whom we call John, has learned 32 words and shows protective behavior toward the younger ones. The second oldest female, Sarah, hums the same melody each night at sunset, a behavior we believe relates to some ritual from their cave existence." If you're watching this right now and your heart aches for these innocent souls trapped by their own bloodline, type * they deserved better * in the comments below. Let their memory know someone finally sees their humanity. For just 4 hours, the jury deliberated before returning a guilty verdict on all counts. Each to 20 years in state prison was the sentence Judge Harold Monroe gave to Elias and Martha Blackwood, remarking, "This court cannot undo the damage inflicted upon these innocent lives, nor heal the generational wounds that led to this tragedy. We can only ensure that this chain of suffering ends here." A complex challenge for the state became the fate of the 7 cave dwellers. With no precedent for such a case, authorities struggled to determine appropriate long-term care. In a specialized residential facility in Morgantown, the 3 youngest, all under the age of 10, were placed, where they received intensive medical care and rehabilitation therapy. Initially housed in a state psychiatric hospital were the 4 older individuals, ranging from approximately 15 to 25 years of age. Their adjustment to conventional indoor living was traumatic. Episodes of extreme distress when confronted with electric lighting, flushing toilets, and other modern conveniences are noted in medical records. Repeatedly, 2 attempted to escape, trying to return to the mountain where they had spent their lives. A breakthrough is described in Dr. Fisher's notes from April 1968. "Today, John voluntarily approached the window and stood watching birds for 17 minutes. When I joined him, he placed my hand on the glass and made the sound we've identified as his term for outside. This represents his first voluntary interaction, seeking connection with the world beyond his immediate surroundings." National attention was attracted by the case, with major publications like *Life* magazine and the *Washington Post* running feature stories. Public debate about rural isolation, consanguinity, and the responsibilities of communities to protect vulnerable members was sparked by the coverage. As evidence of the need for expanded mental health and family services in remote areas, the Blackwood case was cited in a 1969 congressional hearing on rural health care access. Legislation that would increase funding for mobile health clinics and educational outreach programs in Appalachia was championed by Senator Robert Byrd of West Virginia. Meanwhile, on McDowell County, anthropologists and sociologists descended, conducting studies on isolated mountain communities. Their research revealed that while the Blackwood case represented an extreme, other instances of familial intermarriage existed throughout the region, often accompanied by elevated rates of certain genetic disorders. Higher than national average rates of rare recessive disorders in several counties were documented in Dr. Thomas McKnight's 1972 study, Isolation and Genetic Drift in Appalachian Communities. "What we're seeing isn't just the result of inappropriate relations," McKnight wrote, "but of extreme genetic isolation over many generations where even distant cousins marrying cousins creates a narrowing genetic pool." Eventually seized by the county for unpaid taxes was the Blackwood property. In 1971, the cabin was demolished, though hikers occasionally reported finding remnants of the cave dwellings into the early 1980s. That on certain autumn nights, strange sounds can be heard echoing from the limestone caves is held by local legend, though scientists attribute this to wind patterns in the calls of nocturnal animals. Both the resilience of the human spirit and the permanent consequences of genetic isolation are revealed by the long-term outcomes for the rescued Blackwood cave dwellers. Their divergent paths are traced in medical records from the 1970s through the 1990s, offering insights into both their individual journeys and broader scientific understanding of continuity effects. Never developing typical cognitive functions were the three youngest children, despite intensive therapeutic intervention. The youngest girl, estimated to be 4 at the time of rescue and later named Emma by caregivers, suffered from profound skeletal malformations that required multiple surgeries. Despite these interventions, she never gained the ability to walk independently and communicated primarily through a system of hand gestures developed by her occupational therapists. A particularly strong bond with her primary nurse, Helen Martinez, was formed by Emma, who eventually became her legal guardian in 1975. "There's a person inside there who understands far more than she can express," Martinez told researchers in a 1980 interview. "She recognizes music, has preferences for certain colors, and knows exactly when the seasons are changing. That's not coincidence. That's awareness." The middle child, a boy around 7 at rescue named Michael by the state, exhibited less severe physical deformities, but profound developmental delays. He eventually mastered approximately 150 words and could perform basic self-care tasks with supervision, records indicate. A surprising aptitude for music is noted in his medical file, with one therapist documenting his ability to reproduce melodies after a single hearing. The most progress in adaptation was demonstrated by the oldest of the younger group, a girl estimated to be 9 named Rebecca. By her teenage years, she had achieved a functional vocabulary of nearly 400 words and could read at approximately a second-grade level. Her physical abnormalities, while notable, did not prevent basic mobility. A case study in several medical journals became Rebecca's progress, examining the potential for neuroplasticity even after extreme early deprivation. A more troubled path was followed by the fate of the 4 older cave dwellers. Their adaptation to conventional society was limited by their longer exposure to extreme isolation and the more severe manifestations of genetic disorders. For the remainder of their lives, 2 remained institutionalized at the Western State Hospital, where staff noted their preference for darkened rooms and tendency to retreat to small enclosed spaces during periods of stress. The subject of particular interest to researchers studying language acquisition became John, the oldest male. Though never achieving conversational speech, he eventually understood several hundred words and developed a unique system of communication combining the cave-dwelling group's original signs with conventional gestures taught by therapists. Perhaps the most poignant story is that of Sarah, the second oldest female. After 5 years in institutional care, she was transitioned to a specialized group home in 1972, where she lived until her death in 1993 at an estimated age of 50. Her gradual adaptation to modern life is described in caregiver notes, learning to use simple kitchen tools, developing a passion for gardening, and forming attachments to certain staff members. Never speaking more than a few dozen words, Sarah, in her last years, began creating intricate woven patterns using yarn and simple frames. That the patterns incorporated symbols reminiscent of the cave drawings found at the Blackwood property was noted by art therapists, suggesting some form of cultural memory preserved despite her traumatic early life. Significantly to genetic research contributed the medical legacy of the Blackwood case. For scientists studying the effects of consanguinity across multiple generations, valuable data was provided by blood and tissue samples collected with appropriate consent from their court-appointed guardians. Specific gene mutations present in all 7 individuals were identified in a 1985 study published in the American Journal of Medical Genetics *, documenting how these mutations had concentrated and expressed more severely with each generation. This research later informed genetic counseling protocols for communities with histories of familial intermarriage. What makes this case scientifically significant is that we can trace specific recessive alleles through a documented family tree, explained Dr. Rachel Goldman, who studied the Blackwood genetics in the 1990s, showing precisely how genetic disorders amplify when the same problematic genes converge repeatedly over generations. This has provided invaluable insights for predicting inheritance patterns in other isolated genetic populations. For decades, the psychological impact on the local community lingered. Guilt over not recognizing or reporting the situation sooner was expressed by many residents of McDowell County. Special services addressing the community's collective responsibility were held by churches, and age-appropriate discussions about family structures and the importance of reporting suspected inappropriate relationships began to be included in school curricula. By the mid-1970s, both Elias and Martha Blackwood had died in prison, Elias from heart failure in 1972 and Martha from pneumonia in 1975. Remorse was never expressed by either, maintaining until the end that they had protected their offspring from a hostile world that wouldn't understand their ways. Her last coherent statement was reported by prison chaplain Reverend Davis, who met regularly with Martha in her final years. "The mountains have always kept our secrets. They'll keep these too long after I'm gone." Now more than 50 years in the past, the Blackwood case continues to reverberate through medicine, law, and Appalachian cultural studies. Not only in the changed lives of those directly involved can its legacy be measured, but in the institutional and social reforms it helped inspire. By the late 1970s, part of the curriculum at several medical schools had become the story, used to teach students about the genetic consequences of consanguinity and the ethical obligations of rural healthcare providers. Typically titled Genetic Isolation in Rural America, The Blackwood Legacy, the case study emphasizes the importance of recognizing signs of familial inappropriate relations, particularly in isolated communities. We use this case not to sensationalize, but to illustrate how medical professionals must balance cultural sensitivity with their duty to protect vulnerable individuals, explains Dr. Margaret Chun, professor of medical ethics at the University of Pittsburgh. The healthcare providers who interacted with the Blackwoods over decades missed critical warning signs because they were unwilling to broach culturally taboo subjects. As well, legal reforms followed. Reporting requirements for suspected familial and appropriate behavior were strengthened by West Virginia and several other Appalachian states, with special provisions for healthcare workers, educators, and social service providers who serve isolated rural populations. The Blackwood Protocols, as they came to be known in social work circles, established guidelines for intervention in cases where geographical isolation may be concealing inappropriate family situations. These protocols emphasize community-based monitoring systems and regular wellness checks for families in remote areas. Perhaps the most profound impact has been on the collective memory and identity of Appalachian communities themselves. What was once hidden behind a code of silence and non-inference has become part of a broader conversation about the region's history and challenges. That attitudes had shifted dramatically over 3 decades was found by documentarian Sarah Keller, whose 1997 film *Shadows in the Hollow* examined the Blackwood case and its aftermath. The older generation still doesn't want to talk about it directly. They'll say things like that trouble up on Blackwood Ridge or those poor souls in the cave. But younger people are more willing to confront this aspect of regional history, seeing it as part of understanding their cultural inheritance rather than a shameful secret. How the area's folklore incorporated and transformed the Blackwood story has been documented by local historian James Campbell. By the 1980s, mothers were warning children to stay away from Blackwood Ridge or the cave people might get you. It became a cautionary tale, a way of processing cultural trauma through folklore. In 2007, a small memorial was established in the McDowell County Historical Museum commemorating the 7 individuals rescued from the caves. Rather than sensationalizing their condition or origins, the exhibit focuses on their humanity and resilience. In memory of the Blackwood children, whose lives remind us of our shared responsibility to protect the vulnerable among us, reads a simple plaque. Of the original 7 cave dwellers, only 1 remained alive as of 2015. Rebecca, the youngest girl who had shown the most adaptation to conventional society. Now in her late 50s, she resides in a supported living community in Charleston, where she maintains a small garden and participates in an art therapy program. Though her speech remains limited, a rich emotional life has been developed by her, caregivers report, and she forms meaningful connections with staff and fellow residents. Valuable data continue to be yielded by the medical samples collected from the Blackwood individuals. In 2012, specific mutations that had contributed to their conditions were identified by researchers using advanced genomic sequencing, adding to scientific understanding of how recessive disorders manifest and concentrate through familial reproduction. Particularly valuable for genetic counseling in communities with histories of isolation, has this research proven. The Blackwood genetic studies have given us precise models for predicting recurrence risks for specific disorders, notes Dr. James Wilson, a geneticist who has worked with certain religious communities that practiced endogamy. This allows us to provide accurate counseling while respecting cultural practices and individual autonomy. The Blackwood case represents the extreme end of a spectrum that was once more common than we'd like to acknowledge, observes sociologist Dr. Patricia Moley, who has studied changing attitudes toward consanguinity in rural America. As recently as the 1960s, marriage between first cousins was legal in many states and not uncommon in isolated communities. What's changed isn't just the law, but our understanding of both the genetic risks and the social dynamics that allow such situations to persist. Today, the limestone ridge where the Blackwood Caves were located has been incorporated into a state nature preserve. Within a mile of the site, hiking trails pass, though the exact location of the caves is not marked on public maps out of respect for the privacy of those involved and to prevent exploitation of the tragedy. On approved visits to the area, local guide Thomas Jenkins occasionally takes anthropology students and medical researchers. "I don't sensationalize what happened here," he explains. "I talk about the human factors, the isolation, the poverty, the ways communities can fail their most vulnerable members. There are lessons here that go far beyond one family's tragedy. A powerful reminder of how isolation, geographical, cultural, and genetic, can create conditions for tragedy, and how collective responsibility and vigilance are necessary to protect those who cannot protect themselves, is what the Blackwood story ultimately stands as. If you watched all the way through this story, leave a comment saying, *I watched until the end, * so I can get to know you and see who really appreciates the historical cases on this channel. Don't forget to subscribe to uncover more hidden family histories that shaped America's shadow communities. Hit the like button if this case gave you a new perspective on rural isolation, and share this video with someone who appreciates powerful historical documentaries that expose the darker corners of our shared past.